Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. They said they wanted to live off the grid. Away from society, no internet, no electricity, just peace. But that's not the whole truth. Today I've got 7 real stories about workers who met these off-grid people. What they're really doing out there will shock you. Some of these folks aren't hiding from the world. They're hiding something much darker. Subscribe right now, hit like, and comment where you're from. Okay. Let's find out what happens when people truly disappear. Story 1. I'm 31 years old and work as a freelance documentarian, mostly shooting short films about forgotten communities across rural America. Last October, I got contacted by this streaming platform that wanted content about people living completely off-grid. The pay was decent, and honestly, I needed the work. My last relationship had just ended badly. I was behind on rent, and spending a few weeks in the mountains documenting self-sufficient families seemed like exactly the kind of reset I needed. The platform connected me with someone who went by Mountain Mike on various forums dedicated to off-grid living. He claimed to know several families in the remote Appalachian regions of eastern Kentucky who'd been living without any modern conveniences for decades. No electricity, no running water, no contact with the outside world except when absolutely necessary. Mike said he'd been documenting these communities for years and would be willing to guide me to them for the right price. When I met Mike at a truck stop in Hazard, Kentucky, my first instinct was to get back in my car and drive home. The guy was maybe in his 60s, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. His fingernails were black with what I hoped was just dirt, and he had this way of staring that made my skin crawl. But he knew exactly what I was looking for, and promised to take me places no other filmmaker had ever been allowed to go. Mike explained that these weren't your typical off-grid enthusiasts who chose alternative lifestyles for environmental or philosophical reasons. These were families who'd been pushed out of mainstream society generations ago. People who'd developed their own ways of surviving that most folks wouldn't understand or approve of. He warned me that some of their customs might seem strange, but said that if I kept an open mind and showed proper respect, they'd let me document their lives. The drive into the mountains took over 3 hours on increasingly rough roads, until we were basically following deer trails. Mike's beat-up pickup handled terrain that would have destroyed my Honda, and I started worrying about how I'd get back out if something happened to his truck. Eventually, we reached what Mike called the boundary of the first family's territory. He made me turn off my phone and remove the battery, claiming the families could somehow sense electronic signals and wouldn't allow devices that could transmit their location to the outside world. The Harwick family lived in a collection of ramshackle buildings that looked like they'd been constructed from salvaged materials over many decades. The main house was a patchwork of different types of wood and metal, with additions built whenever the family expanded. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and I could smell something cooking that made my stomach turn. It wasn't just wood smoke. There was a sweet, organic odor that reminded me of roadkill left too long in summer heat. Martha Harwick, the family matriarch, had to be in her 70s but moved with surprising energy. She welcomed Mike like an old friend and seemed genuinely excited about having their lives documented. Her son Thomas was probably in his 40s, quiet but friendly enough. There were maybe a dozen other family members of various ages, all watching me with the kind of intense curiosity you'd expect from people who rarely saw outsiders. What struck me immediately was how close-knit they were, but in a way that felt almost uncomfortable to observe. They touched each other constantly, hands on shoulders, brief embraces, whispered conversations with faces inches apart. The younger family members, especially the women, seemed to defer to Martha's every word with an intensity that went beyond normal family respect. They agreed to let me stay in a small cabin about 50 yards from the main house. The building was primitive but clean, with a wood stove for heat and an oil lamp for light. Martha explained that they rarely had visitors, but when they did, the cabin was where guests stayed so as not to disrupt the family's routines. She brought me dinner that first night, some kind of stew that actually tasted better than it smelled, along with bread that was probably the best I'd ever eaten. Over the first few days, I filmed their daily routines. They raised their own livestock, grew most of their food, and had systems for preserving meat and vegetables that kept them fed year-round. The men hunted regularly, and the women maintained gardens that produced vegetables I'd never seen before. They seemed genuinely self-sufficient in ways that impressed me professionally, even if some of their methods seemed inefficient by modern standards. But there were things that didn't feel right from the beginning. I noticed that none of the family members ever seemed to be alone. There was always someone else nearby, watching. When I'd try to interview individuals privately, other family members would inevitably appear and either join the conversation or find reasons for the person to leave. It was like they were monitoring each other constantly. The family's children behaved strangely too. There were maybe 6 or 7 kids, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, but they were eerily quiet and obedient. They rarely spoke unless directly addressed by an adult, and when they did talk, it was always in whispers. The older children watched the younger ones with an intensity that seemed more like surveillance than normal sibling attention. On my 4th night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to voices outside my cabin. Through the window, I could see several family members standing in a circle near the main house, having what looked like an intense discussion. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested some kind of disagreement. After about 20 minutes, they dispersed. But I noticed that someone remained stationed near my cabin for the rest of the night. The next day, Martha suggested I might want to meet another family who lived deeper in the mountains. She said the Kesslers had been off-grid even longer than the Harwicks, and might provide better material for my documentary. Mike seemed reluctant, but Martha insisted that my project wouldn't be complete without documenting the Kesslers' way of life. Something about the way she pushed the idea made me nervous, but professionally, I couldn't pass up the opportunity. The journey to the Kessler property took most of the day, following paths that barely qualified as trails. Mike seemed increasingly uncomfortable as we went deeper into the mountains, checking his watch constantly and muttering about needing to be back before dark. When I asked why, he said the Kesslers had different rules about when visitors could be on their land. The Kessler homestead was even more isolated than the Harwick place, consisting of a large cabin and several smaller outbuildings arranged around a central clearing. What immediately caught my attention was how quiet everything was. No birds, no insects, none of the usual forest sounds you'd expect. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive. Jacob Kessler met us at the edge of the clearing. He was a massive man, probably 6.5 feet tall, with hands that looked like they could crush bone without effort. His wife Sarah was almost as tall, with pale skin and eyes that seemed to look right through me. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who watched me with the kind of predatory focus that reminded me of hunting cats sizing up prey. The Kessler setup was more sophisticated than the Harwicks in some ways, but also more disturbing. They had systems for collecting rainwater that seemed almost industrial in scale, and food storage areas that looked like they could sustain a much larger group through a long siege. When I commented on their preparedness, Jacob explained that they'd learned to be self-sufficient because people from outside couldn't be trusted to leave them alone. That evening, Sarah prepared dinner while I filmed their food preparation process. She worked with ingredients I couldn't identify, some of which looked like they might have been preserved meat, but the texture and color weren't quite right. When I asked about their protein sources, Jacob said they raised their own livestock and also harvested what the mountains provided. The family's interaction patterns were even more disturbing than the Harwicks. The children never spoke directly to me, communicating only through their parents even when I addressed them personally. They moved with a synchronized precision that suggested extensive training or conditioning. During dinner, they ate in complete silence, watching me eat with expressions I couldn't interpret. After dinner, Jacob suggested I might want to see their food storage areas. He led me to what looked like a root cellar, but when he opened the heavy wooden door, the smell that emerged made me step back involuntarily. It was the same sweet, organic odor I'd noticed at the Harwick place, but much stronger. Jacob seemed amused by my reaction and invited me to step inside for a closer look. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, with shelves lining the walls from floor to ceiling. Most contained typical preserved foods, vegetables, grains, what looked like jerky, but there were other containers that held things I couldn't identify. Some appeared to contain meat that had been processed in ways I'd never seen before. Jacob explained that they'd developed preservation techniques passed down through generations, methods that allowed them to store protein for years without refrigeration. I was filming the storage area when one of the children, the youngest boy, probably 8 years old, appeared at the cellar entrance. He whispered something to his father in a language I didn't recognize. Jacob's expression changed immediately, becoming tense and alert. He told me we needed to return to the surface right away. Back in the main cabin, Sarah was standing at the window looking out into the darkness. She turned to her husband and said something in that same strange language. Jacob responded sharply, then turned to Mike and me. He said there had been a change in plans. We would be staying the night, and leaving first thing in the morning would be advisable. Mike looked terrified. He kept checking his watch and muttering about needing to get back to his truck. When I asked what was wrong, Jacob said that sometimes other families in the area became territorial about outsiders, especially after dark. It would be safer to wait until daylight before traveling. They put us in a small room with 2 cots, but I could tell Mike had no intention of sleeping. He sat on the edge of his cot, fully dressed, listening to every sound outside. Around midnight, I heard voices in the distance, multiple people having what sounded like an argument. Mike grabbed my arm and whispered that we needed to stay completely quiet no matter what we heard. The voices got closer over the next hour, and I could make out individual words even though the language was unfamiliar. It sounded like negotiation or bargaining, with Jacob's voice clearly distinguishable among the others. There were periods of silence followed by intense discussion, as if decisions were being made and reconsidered. Around 3 a.m., everything went quiet. Mike relaxed slightly, but he still wouldn't try to sleep. When I asked what had just happened, he said the Kesslers had been settling territorial disputes with neighboring families. He wouldn't elaborate beyond saying that mountain families had their own ways of resolving conflicts that didn't involve outside authorities. At dawn, Sarah brought us breakfast, more of the bread and what she called mountain coffee that was stronger than anything I'd ever tasted. Jacob announced that Mike and I would be leaving immediately, and that I had enough material for my documentary. When I protested that I'd only been filming for 2 days, he said that some experiences weren't meant to be shared with the outside world. The trip back to Mike's truck took longer than expected because we were following a different route. Mike explained that the path we'd used the day before wasn't safe anymore due to the territorial discussions from the night before. As we walked, I noticed markers carved into trees, symbols that looked like warnings or boundary signs. Mike carefully avoided certain areas, sometimes taking long detours around places that looked perfectly passable. When we finally reached the truck, I realized we weren't alone. There were other people watching us from the tree line, at least 4 or 5 figures that would disappear when I tried to look directly at them. Mike saw them too and moved faster, throwing our equipment into the truck bed without his usual care. He didn't speak until we were back on something that resembled an actual road. That's when he told me what had really happened the night before. The Kessler family hadn't been settling territorial disputes. They'd been negotiating my fate with other families in the area. Apparently, my presence had created problems between different groups who had agreements about outsiders. Some families wanted me gone immediately, while others had different ideas about how to handle the situation. Mike explained that these mountain communities had developed their own justice systems over generations of isolation. They'd learned that involving outside authorities led to unwanted attention and government interference. So they handled problems internally, using methods that ensured outsiders wouldn't become problems again. He wouldn't say exactly what those methods involved, but the way he spoke made it clear that not all visitors to these mountains made it back out. The Kessler family had apparently vouched for me, arguing that I seemed trustworthy and that my documentary might actually help protect their privacy by showing that they were just simple people trying to live independently. But other families disagreed, saying that any documentation posed risks to their way of life. The discussion had continued most of the night before a compromise was reached. I was allowed to leave, but with conditions. Any footage I'd shot would need to be reviewed and approved before I could use it. Names, locations, and identifying details would have to be obscured beyond recognition. And most importantly, I could never return or guide anyone else to these communities. Mike made it clear that violating these conditions would have consequences that local authorities wouldn't be able to address. When we got back to the truck stop where I'd left my car, Mike gave me a flash drive with the approved footage. Most of my material had been edited down to generic scenes of people cooking, gardening, and doing basic homestead activities. All the identifying features had been removed, faces blurred or kept in shadow, voices altered beyond recognition. What remained was barely usable for my documentary project. Mike also gave me an envelope containing cash, payment for consulting services that was triple what the streaming platform had promised me. When I asked about the extra money, he said it was compensation for my discretion and a reminder that some stories were worth more when they weren't told. I drove home that day with my equipment, my approved footage, and a completely different understanding of what off-grid living could mean in the remotest parts of Appalachia. The documentary I eventually produced was generic enough to satisfy the streaming platform's requirements, but it bore no resemblance to what I'd actually experienced in those mountains. Looking back now, 6 months later, I still don't know exactly what I witnessed in those communities. I have theories about what the strange food preservation methods actually involved, what those nighttime negotiations were really about, and why some visitors might not make it back from the deep mountains. But those are theories I keep to myself. I've since shifted my work to focus on urban communities and suburban lifestyle documentaries. I still get occasional messages from Mountain Mike, usually just checking to make sure I'm honoring our agreement. I always respond promptly and positively. Some arrangements are too important to risk violating. The extra cash helped me get caught up on my bills and even move to a better apartment. I try to think of it as payment for a valuable lesson about the boundaries between curiosity and survival. Some stories are meant to stay hidden in the mountains where they belong, with the people who understand what it really costs to keep them secret. I still have nightmares sometimes about that smell in the cellar, about the synchronized way the Kessler children moved, about the voices negotiating in the darkness. But I've learned that some experiences change you in ways that can't be undone, only managed. I know now that there are communities in those mountains that have developed their own solutions to problems the outside world can't understand or wouldn't approve of. And I know that sometimes the price of learning those solutions is higher than most people would be willing to pay. I've never gone back to Eastern Kentucky, and I never will. I'm 35 and work as a forest ranger in West Virginia. Been patrolling the remote sections of the mountains for about 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these hills had to offer. My name's Mike Carter, and up until 2 years ago, I figured the worst thing I'd encounter out here would be maybe a black bear or some lost weekend warriors who bit off more than they could chew on the trails. I live in a small cabin about 20 minutes outside of Lewisburg, and most days I love this job. The pay isn't great, but there's something about being out in those ancient mountains that just feels right, you know? Like you're part of something bigger than yourself. The thing is, when you work in law enforcement, even the park ranger kind, you get used to dealing with missing persons cases. Usually, it's some college kid who wandered off a marked trail chasing a photo opportunity, or maybe an elderly hiker who got turned around and spent a cold night in the woods before we found them. 9 times out of 10, these stories have happy endings. But there's always that one case that sticks with you, the one that doesn't make sense, no matter how many times you go over the details in your head. For me, that case started in the fall of 2022, when I got assigned to investigate a string of disappearances in one of the most remote areas of my patrol sector. 7 people had gone missing over the course of 2 years. All of them experienced outdoors types who knew what they were doing. These weren't your typical weekend warriors. We're talking about serious hikers, people who'd been exploring these mountains for decades. The kind of folks who could navigate by the stars and find water in a drought. The kind who didn't just vanish. Now, the area where these disappearances were happening is what we call the deep country. It's where some of the old mountain families still live pretty much off the grid, the way their great-great-grandparents did. These families have been in these hills since before West Virginia was even a state. And they know every rock, every stream, every game trail better than any GPS ever could. When the state police asked for help with the search efforts, these families stepped up without hesitation. The Blackwood clan in particular had been incredibly helpful. Old Samuel Blackwood, who had to be pushing 70 but moved through the forest like he was half his age, had organized search parties with his sons and grandsons. They'd covered more ground in a week than our official teams had managed in a month. Samuel's family had been living in these mountains for over 200 years, and if anyone could find a missing person in this terrain, it was them. What struck me about the Blackwoods was how seriously they took the whole thing. These were tough mountain people who dealt with everything from wildcats to winter storms that could kill you if you weren't careful. But there was something in old Samuel's eyes when he talked about the missing hikers that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was close. Respect, maybe, or caution. The first few times I met with Samuel and his boys to coordinate search efforts, everything seemed pretty straightforward. They'd show me maps, hand-drawn ones that had been passed down through generations, and point out areas where someone might get lost or injured. But as the weeks went on and we kept coming up empty-handed, Samuel started mentioning things that made my job a lot more complicated. "There's something old in the deep parts," he told me one evening as we sat around a fire at his family's homestead. His voice was quiet, and he kept looking out toward the tree line like he was expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Been here longer than us, longer than anyone. My grandfather used to tell stories about it." I figured he was talking about local folklore, the kind of ghost stories that every mountain community has. But when I pressed him for details, he walked me over to a shed behind his house and showed me something that made me rethink everything I thought I knew about these mountains. It was a collection of cave paintings, done on pieces of flat stone that looked like they'd been carefully removed from somewhere deeper in the mountains. The images were crude but unmistakable, large, reptilian creatures hunting human figures. The humans in the paintings were carrying what looked like spears and torches, but they were clearly running, clearly afraid. "Family's been keeping these safe for 5 generations, Samuel said, running his weathered fingers over the stone. "Found them in the deep caves when my great-great-grandfather first settled here. The Cherokee who lived here before us. They warned him about going too deep underground, said there were things down there that should be left alone." I have to admit, my first instinct was to dismiss all of this as local superstition. I'm a practical guy, always have been. I believe in what I can see and touch and prove. But as Samuel kept talking, showing me more artifacts and old family journals, I started to realize that the Blackwood family had been dealing with something very real for a very long time. The journals, written in careful handwriting by Samuel's ancestors, described encounters with what they called cave dragons, going back to the early 1800s. The creatures were described as intelligent, territorial, and primarily interested in hunting humans who ventured too deep into their underground domain. The families had learned to coexist with them by following strict rules. Stay out of the deep cave systems, don't hunt alone in certain areas, and always travel in groups when moving through the creature's territory. "We've kept the peace for 200 years, Samuel explained. "But these new people coming through, these hikers and such, they don't know the rules. They see a cave entrance and think it's just another thing to explore." As he spoke, I found myself thinking about the evidence we'd found during our searches. All 7 missing hikers had last been seen near cave entrances. Their abandoned camping gear always showed the same type of damage: massive claw marks and what looked like acid burns on the metal components. We'd found bone fragments too, human bones that had been partially dissolved by some kind of acid we couldn't identify. Looking back now, I realized that Samuel was trying to warn me about what we were dealing with without actually coming out and saying it. The Blackwood family had been protecting their community and these creatures for generations, maintaining a balance that most people couldn't even imagine. But that balance was being threatened by the modern world, by people like me who didn't understand what we were walking into. It was Samuel's grandson, David, who finally convinced me to see the evidence for myself. David was about my age, a quiet guy who worked as a hunting guide and knew these mountains better than anyone. He offered to take me deep into the cave system where his family believed the creatures lived, but only if I was willing to accept what I might find there. "You seem like a decent man, Mike," he told me one afternoon as we were wrapping up another fruitless search. "But you're looking for these missing people in all the wrong places. If you really want to know what happened to them, you're going to have to go where no park ranger has ever gone before." I should have said no. I should have stuck to the official search protocols and left the cave exploration to the experts. But I'd been having nightmares about those missing hikers, and I knew that if I didn't find out what happened to them, I'd never be able to live with myself. So I told David I was ready to see whatever he wanted to show me. 3 days later, David led me to a cave entrance I'd never seen on any official map. It was hidden behind a waterfall, accessible only by rappelling down a 60-foot cliff face. As we descended into the darkness, David kept talking about his family's history with the creatures, explaining the rules that had kept the peace for so many generations. "They're not evil," he said as we moved deeper underground. "They're just old, older than anything else in these mountains. They were here when the first humans arrived, and they'll probably be here long after we're gone. But they're territorial, and they're smart. They know the difference between someone who belongs here and someone who's just passing through." The caves were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The passages had clearly been carved by something other than water erosion. The walls were too smooth, too deliberate, and the deeper we went, the more evidence we found of the creature's presence. Massive claw marks in the stone, shed scales that were larger than any reptile I'd ever heard of, and areas that were clearly being used as nesting sites. It was in one of these nesting areas that we found the fresh evidence I'd been dreading. Personal belongings from the missing hikers, arranged in careful piles like trophies. Clothing, equipment, even identification cards, all placed with an almost ceremonial precision that suggested intelligence and purpose. David was examining one of the piles when we heard it, a sound like nothing I'd ever experienced before. It was part growl, part hiss, with an underlying vibration that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. David immediately dropped to a crouch and motioned for me to do the same. "They know we're here," he whispered. "Just stay calm and don't make any sudden movements." From somewhere deeper in the cave system, I could hear something massive moving toward us. The sound of claws on stone, the scrape of scales against rock, and that breathing. Deep, slow, deliberate. When the beam of my flashlight finally caught a glimpse of what was approaching us, I understood why Samuel's family had spent 2 centuries treating these creatures with such respect. The thing that emerged from the darkness was easily 15 feet long, with a reptilian head the size of a barrel, and eyes that reflected my flashlight beam with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. Its scales were dark green and black, mottled like an alligator's hide, but its body was built more like a monitor lizard. Lean, powerful, designed for both climbing and swimming. But it was the eyes that really got to me. They weren't the empty, predatory stare of an animal. They were calculating, curious, almost human in their intelligence. The creature studied us for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. David spoke to it in what sounded like a mixture of English and some other language I didn't recognize, his voice calm and respectful. He gestured slowly toward the way we'd come, and after a long moment, the creature stepped aside, allowing us to pass. "What did you say to it?" I asked once we were safely back outside. "Old words," David replied. "Cherokee mixed with some German my family brought from the old country. The important thing is that it understood. These creatures, they're smart enough to recognize respect when they see it." Over the next few hours, David explained how his family had maintained their relationship with the creatures for so many generations. It wasn't just about staying out of certain caves. It was about understanding that these mountains belonged to something older and more powerful than human civilization. The creatures had allowed the Blackwood family to live in their territory because the family had always shown proper respect and had never betrayed their trust. But the modern world was making that relationship more complicated. Hikers and campers were exploring areas that had been off-limits for generations, and the creatures were responding to this intrusion the only way they knew how. They were protecting their territory, and unfortunately, that meant eliminating the threats. "The thing is," David explained, "these aren't mindless monsters. They're just trying to survive in a world that's changing around them. But they can't tell the difference between someone who means them harm and someone who's just curious. To them, any human in their territory is a potential threat." As a forest ranger, I found myself in an impossible situation. I had a responsibility to protect the public, but I also couldn't ignore what I'd seen in those caves. These creatures were probably the last of their kind, ancient predators that had somehow managed to survive in the deepest parts of the mountains. They deserved protection just as much as any endangered species, but they also posed a genuine threat to anyone who ventured into their territory. After several long conversations with David and his grandfather, we came up with a solution that would protect both the creatures and the hiking public. The Blackwood family helped me identify all the cave systems that the creatures used as their primary habitat, and I worked with the state to have those areas designated as protected environmental zones. Officially, we classified them as sensitive bat hibernation areas that were off-limits to the public year-round. The designation process took months of paperwork and bureaucratic maneuvering, But eventually, we managed to get the entire area classified as a no-access zone. We installed warning signs, rerouted hiking trails, and even set up motion-activated cameras to monitor compliance. To the public, it looked like just another conservation effort. Only a few of us knew what we were really protecting. For the missing hikers, we developed cover stories that would satisfy their families without revealing the truth. Tragic accidents, falls into inaccessible ravines, flash floods that swept away all evidence. It wasn't easy lying to grieving families, but the alternative, telling them their loved ones had been killed by creatures that officially didn't exist, would have been worse for everyone involved. The creatures, for their part, seemed to understand and accept the new arrangement. David continued to monitor their activity through the traditional methods his family had always used, and there were no more disappearances in the protected areas. The ancient predators had their territory back, and hikers were safely redirected to trails that didn't intersect with creature habitat. But the whole experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I used to think I knew these mountains, thought I understood what lived in them, and how the ecosystem worked. Now I realize that there are layers of history and life here that go deeper than anything I learned in ranger training. There are things in these hills that predate human civilization, things that we've barely begun to understand. I still work as a forest ranger, but my job has expanded beyond what's written in any official manual. I'm one of the guardians now, part of a secret that goes back generations. I work closely with the Blackwood family to monitor the boundaries we've established, and I train the rangers who come after me about the hidden dangers that exist in certain parts of the mountains. It's a responsibility I never asked for, but one I take seriously. These creatures aren't monsters, they're survivors, the last remnants of something ancient and important. They have as much right to exist in these mountains as any other wildlife, maybe more. The fact that they've managed to survive this long, adapting to the presence of human civilization while maintaining their essential nature, is something that deserves respect rather than fear. Sometimes, late at night in my cabin, I think about those missing hikers and wonder if there was another way to handle the whole situation. But then I remember the intelligence in those reptilian eyes, the careful way the creatures arranged their trophies, the respect that the Blackwood family had shown them for 200 years. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with conventional wildlife management techniques. This was something that required wisdom that goes back generations, an understanding of the mountains that runs deeper than any government manual or university degree. Looking back now, I realize that my encounter in those caves was more than just a wildlife management crisis. It was an initiation into something older and more complex than I'd ever imagined. I'm not just a forest ranger anymore. I'm a keeper of secrets, a guardian of boundaries that most people will never know exist. And honestly, I'm okay with that. These mountains have taught me that there are some things more important than transparency, some truths that are better kept hidden for the protection of everyone involved. The ancient predators are still down there, in the deep caves beneath the West Virginia mountains. They're watching, waiting, maintaining the balance that has allowed them to survive for thousands of years. And as long as I'm able, I'll be watching too, making sure that balance is never disturbed again. I was 32 when I made the worst mistake of my life, responding to a handwritten letter about learning traditional beekeeping techniques. This was 3 years ago, and I still wake up screaming some nights. I've never told anyone the full truth about what happened in those mountains, but I can't keep carrying this alone anymore. I was running a small commercial beekeeping operation out of North Carolina at the time. Nothing fancy, just me, my truck, and about 40 hives that I'd move around to different farms for pollination contracts. The money was getting tight with all the colony collapse issues, so when I heard about this mountain family producing honey that sold for $200 a pound, I figured it was worth investigating. The tip came from Pete, who owned a health food store in Asheville. He told me about the Morrison family, 5 generations of beekeepers living completely off-grid in an isolated Tennessee hollow. Their honey was supposed to have properties unlike anything he'd ever seen. People would drive hours just to buy a single jar. Pete gave me their contact information and said if I was serious about learning traditional methods, they might be willing to teach me. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to how Pete's hands shook when he talked about them. how he kept glancing at the door like he was worried someone might be listening, how he made me promise not to mention his name if I contacted them. But I was desperate to save my failing business, and the opportunity seemed too good to pass up. It took 3 weeks to get a response to my letter. When it came, it was written in the most beautiful handwriting I'd ever seen, like old-fashioned calligraphy. But there was something unsettling about the perfectly uniform letter spacing. The paper felt strange too, almost waxy, with a faint sweet smell that reminded me of honey but wasn't quite right. The letter was signed by Daniel Morrison, and he agreed to teach me their family methods in exchange for help with physical labor around their operation. He included detailed directions to their property, but warned me it was 25 miles from the nearest neighbor and I'd need to bring supplies for at least 2 weeks. The directions were incredibly precise, almost obsessively so, noting every turn, every landmark, even specific trees I should watch for. The drive into the mountains took longer than I expected. My GPS lost signal after about 40 minutes, and the paved roads gave way to dirt logging roads that got narrower and more overgrown as I climbed higher. What bothered me most was the silence. These mountains should have been full of bird calls, insect noise, the normal sounds of a healthy forest. Instead, I drove for 2 hours through what felt like a dead zone. When I finally reached the Morrison property, the first thing I noticed was how unnaturally green everything looked. This was late September. The mountains should have been showing fall colors, but the hollow where their property sat was still lush and vibrant in a way that didn't match the surrounding landscape. Their farmhouse was old but well-maintained, probably built in the early 1900s. Behind it, I could see dozens of wooden beehives scattered across a meadow that stretched back toward thick forest. 3 men came out to greet me, and I immediately felt something was wrong. They were clearly brothers, same lean build, same weathered faces, but there was something off about the way they moved. Too coordinated, like they were all responding to the same signal. When they introduced themselves as Daniel, Thomas, and Samuel, their voices had the same cadence, the same inflection. It was subtle, but deeply unsettling. Daniel, the middle brother who'd written to me, showed me to a small cabin where I'd be staying. The cabin was clean and comfortable, but it felt wrong somehow. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs, all showing the same 3 men with beehives. But the photos spanned decades. CS. I could see the brothers as children, teenagers, young men, middle-aged, and their current ages. The thing was, the proportions were wrong. In some of the older photos, they looked exactly the same age they were now. In others, they appeared younger than they should have been for the time period. That first night at dinner, I tried to ask about their family history and their beekeeping methods. The brothers would answer my questions, but always in unison, finishing each other's sentences in a way that felt rehearsed. When I asked about other family members, parents, wives, children, they just smiled and said the bees were their only family now. The honey they served with dinner was unlike anything I'd ever tasted. It had an almost narcotic effect. After just a few spoonfuls, I felt incredibly relaxed and sleepy. My vision started to blur slightly, and I had to excuse myself early to go back to the cabin. As I walked across the dark meadow, I could hear the brothers still talking on the porch, but they were speaking in perfect unison now, their 3 voices creating this strange harmonic effect that made my skin crawl. I slept deeply that night, but I had the most vivid nightmares. I dreamed I was trapped inside a massive hive, surrounded by buzzing that grew louder and louder until it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. I could feel thousands of tiny legs crawling over my skin, and when I tried to scream, honey poured out of my mouth instead of sound. The next morning, Daniel took me out to examine the hives. I'd been keeping bees for 8 years, but what I saw in that meadow defied everything I knew about bee behavior. The hives weren't arranged randomly like most operations. They formed perfect geometric patterns across the meadow, creating shapes that were almost mathematical in their precision. When we approached the first hive, Daniel didn't put on any protective gear. He just walked right up to it and started making these low whistling sounds. The bees that emerged moved like they were following choreographed instructions, forming organized patterns in the air rather than the chaotic buzzing I was used to. They know family from strangers, Daniel told me, but the way he said family made my blood run cold. It wasn't the warm way most people talk about relatives. It was clinical, possessive, like the bees weren't just insects they kept, but something they belonged to. The bees themselves were wrong. They were much larger than standard honeybees, maybe 50% bigger, and their coloration was off. Instead of the normal golden brown, they had this dark, almost metallic sheen that seemed to shift in the light. But the most disturbing thing was how they watched me. Individual bees would hover near my face for long periods, studying me with an intelligence that insects shouldn't possess. Over the next few days, I started noticing other wrongness around the property. There were no other insects anywhere, no flies, no mosquitoes, no wasps, nothing. The Morrison bees seemed to have eliminated every other species from their territory. I found the dried husks of what looked like hornets and yellow jackets scattered around the edge of the meadow, drained of all moisture like they'd been mummified. The brothers' behavior became more unsettling as I spent time with them. They would move in perfect synchronization without seeming to communicate. When one would reach for a tool, another would already be handing it to him. They'd start and stop sentences at exactly the same moments, share glances that lasted too long, and sometimes they'd all turn to look at me simultaneously for no apparent reason. On my 5th night there, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of voices outside my cabin. I looked out the window and saw all 3 brothers standing in the meadow, perfectly still, their arms at their sides. They were talking, but in that same unison voice I'd heard the first night. What made my blood freeze was that the conversation was about me. "The integration is proceeding faster than expected," they said together. "Physical changes should begin within the week. Mental barriers are already weakening." I crept closer to the window, trying to hear more, but something touched my shoulder. I spun around to find Samuel standing right behind me inside the cabin. I hadn't heard him come in. There was no way he could have gotten from the meadow to inside my cabin that quickly. "You should be sleeping," he said in that same emotionless tone. "The process works better when the subject is unconscious." I backed away from him, my heart hammering. "What process? What are you talking about?" Samuel tilted his head at an unnatural angle, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he smiled, and I saw that his teeth were covered with tiny hexagonal indentations, like honeycomb patterns had been carved into the enamel. "The symbiosis," he said. "We've been adding preparations to your food since you arrived. The colony needs expansion, and you're genetically compatible." I ran. I crashed through the cabin door and sprinted toward my truck, keys in my hand. Behind me, I could hear all 3 brothers calling my name in perfect unison, but their voices were changing, taking on a buzzing quality that made my ears hurt. My truck wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again, but nothing happened. Through the windshield, I could see the brothers walking toward me across the meadow, moving with that same synchronized gait. But now there were bees surrounding them, thousands of bees forming dark clouds that moved like extensions of their bodies. I abandoned the truck and ran into the forest. The moon was bright enough that I could see the old logging road I'd driven in on, and I followed it as best I could, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over roots. Behind me, I could hear the buzzing getting closer, and occasionally I'd catch glimpses of that dark swarm moving through the trees. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning and my legs cramping. The buzzing would get close, then fade away, then surge back again, like they were herding me in a specific direction. When I finally collapsed from exhaustion, I realized I wasn't on the logging road anymore. I was in a small clearing I'd never seen before, surrounded by what looked like dozens of abandoned beehives. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. The hives weren't empty, they were full of something that wasn't quite bees and wasn't quite human. The creatures moving in and out of the hives had bee-like bodies, but human faces, or human bodies covered in insect carapaces. Some were clearly in intermediate stages of transformation, with limbs that were part arm, part insect leg, and skin that showed patches of chitin and honeycomb patterns. In the center of the clearing stood a massive structure that might have once been a hive but had grown into something architectural, with chambers and passages that seemed to extend deep underground. And standing in front of it were dozens of people, or things that had once been people, all watching me with the same empty expression I'd seen on the Morrison brothers. "Welcome to the expansion site," they said in unison, their combined voices creating that same harmonic buzzing I'd heard in my nightmares. "You've been selected for integration. The process has already begun." I looked down at my hands and saw tiny hexagonal patterns forming under my skin. My fingernails were starting to turn black and develop ridges. When I touched my face, I could feel small bumps forming along my jawline. I screamed and ran again, crashing blindly through the forest. I have no memory of how I eventually made it back to the main road or how I got home. I found myself in a hospital in Knoxville 3 days later, severely dehydrated and covered in scratches. The doctor said hikers had found me wandering along Highway 411, delirious and speaking about bees. But the changes had already started. Over the next few weeks, the hexagonal patterns under my skin became more pronounced. I developed an allergic reaction to most foods except for honey and royal jelly. My sleep cycles changed so that I was most active at dawn and dusk. Most disturbing, I started hearing the buzzing, a constant low-frequency hum that seemed to come from inside my own head. I tried to convince myself it was psychological trauma, some kind of stress reaction to whatever had happened in those mountains. But the physical changes were undeniable. My dentist noticed that my teeth were developing unusual grooves. My doctor was baffled by blood work that showed radical changes in my hormone levels and brain chemistry. 6 months after my escape, I got another handwritten letter. Same perfect calligraphy, same waxy paper with that sweet sick smell. This one was shorter. The integration is incomplete. You cannot remain between states indefinitely. When you're ready to finish the process, return to the mountains. The colony is waiting. I burned the letter, but I kept having dreams about the clearing, about the hive structure, about the synchronized voices calling my name. The buzzing in my head got louder, and I started understanding it. It wasn't random noise. It was communication, commands, instructions from something that considered me its property. That's when I learned about the others. Through online forums about unexplained medical conditions, I found dozens of people reporting similar symptoms after visiting isolated mountain communities throughout Appalachia. They all described the same progression: invitation to learn traditional skills, gradual physical changes, buzzing in their heads, and eventually, compulsions to return to the mountains. Most of them eventually did return. Their last posts would be about finally understanding their purpose, about joining something larger than individual human consciousness. Their families never heard from them again. Missing persons reports were filed, but searches never found any trace of the communities they'd gone to visit. I'm writing this because I can feel my resistance breaking down. The buzzing is constant now, and sometimes I catch myself walking toward my car with no memory of deciding to leave the house. The hexagonal patterns are spreading up my arms and across my chest. My reflection in the mirror shows someone who's no longer entirely human. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a jar of honey with a note. To ease the transition. The colony grows impatient. I know I shouldn't have tasted it, but the craving was overwhelming. It was the most perfect thing I'd ever experienced, like every pleasure I'd ever felt, condensed into something I could consume. I've been taking small amounts every day since then. The buzzing is getting clearer, more organized. I'm starting to understand what the Morrison brothers meant about symbiosis, about belonging to something greater than individual consciousness. The rational part of my mind knows this is wrong, knows I'm being systematically altered by something that views humans as raw material for expansion. But it's getting harder to care about being human when I can feel the vast intelligence of the collective reaching out to me, offering perfect harmony, perfect purpose, perfect belonging. The hexagonal patterns don't seem ugly anymore. They're beautiful, efficient, natural. The buzzing isn't noise, it's the sound of coming home. I'm not sure how much longer I can resist the compulsion to return to those mountains. If you're reading this and I've disappeared, don't come looking for me. Don't investigate remote beekeeping operations or traditional farming communities that seem too perfect, too isolated, too welcoming to strangers. And if you ever receive a handwritten letter inviting you to learn old-fashioned skills from mountain families, burn it. Don't read it twice. Don't let curiosity overcome common sense like I did. The buzzing is getting louder as I write this. I can feel them calling to me, telling me it's time to come home, time to complete the process I started 3 years ago. Part of me wants to fight it, but a larger part is tired of being alone, tired of being incomplete. If you find this document, know that I tried to warn you. Know that somewhere in the mountains of Appalachia, there are communities that aren't what they appear to be, where the people you meet aren't entirely people anymore, where traditional skills are just bait for something that turns humans into components of a larger organism. The honey tastes so sweet, the buzzing is almost musical now. I think I understand what they meant about symbiosis. I think I'm ready to go home. I can see my car keys on the table. My hands are moving toward them without my conscious decision. The hexagonal patterns on my skin are glowing faintly in the lamplight. This is my last entry as myself. If anyone finds this, please understand. I'm not disappearing because I want to. I'm disappearing because I no longer have a choice. The colony is calling, and I can't resist anymore. I was 30 when this happened, working as an electrical line technician for Kentucky Power Company. Most people don't think much about where their electricity comes from until the lights go out. But I'd spent 8 years crawling up poles and fixing lines across eastern Kentucky. My supervisor knew I was good with the technical stuff and didn't mind working alone in remote areas, which is probably why he sent me on what turned out to be the worst assignment of my life. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was finishing my coffee outside a diner in Prestonsburg when my phone rang. "Chris," my supervisor said, "we've got reports of people stealing power from our lines up near the Virginia border. Off-grid folks are apparently tapping into our system illegally. Need you to go up there, document everything, and cut them off." Power theft wasn't uncommon in rural areas. People would run underground cables from our lines to their properties, thinking we wouldn't notice the drain. Usually, it was pretty straightforward. Find the illegal connection, disconnect it, report it to the authorities. I figured this would be a routine day. The drive took me deep into the mountains, up winding roads that got narrower and more remote with every mile. Cell service cut out about 20 minutes in, which was normal for that area. The landscape was beautiful in that stark autumn way, trees just starting to turn colors, morning mist hanging in the valleys. I'd driven these mountain roads hundreds of times for work, but something felt different that day. The silence was too complete. No birds, no insects, even the wind seemed muted. I found the first house around noon, a ramshackle cabin sitting about a quarter-mile off the main road. The place looked abandoned from a distance, no vehicles visible, windows dark, weeds growing up through the porch boards. But as I got closer, I could see signs of recent habitation. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, a small garden with recently harvested vegetables, and most telling of all, electrical cables running from the direction of our power lines. I knocked on the door and waited. No answer, but I could hear movement inside. The kind of careful, deliberate movement of someone trying not to be heard. I knocked again, harder this time. "Power company," I called out. "Need to speak with the property owner about your electrical service." The door opened just a crack, and I found myself looking at a pale, thin face peering out from the darkness inside. It was a woman, maybe 40 years old, with stringy blonde hair and the kind of hollow-eyed look you see in people who've been living rough for too long. "We don't use your power," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're off-grid. Ma'am, I can see the cables running from our lines to your property. That's theft of electrical service, and I need to disconnect it." She stared at me for a long moment, then opened the door wider. Behind her, I could see into the cabin's interior. What I saw made my skin crawl. The walls were covered with electrical cables, not proper wiring, but hundreds of extension cords, power strips, and jury-rigged connections creating a chaotic web that covered every surface. The smell coming from inside was awful: ozone, burned plastic, and something organic and rotten. "We only take what we need," she whispered. "They told us we could." "Who told you that?" But she'd already stepped back and started closing the door. "You shouldn't be here. They don't like strangers." Before I could ask any more questions, the door slammed shut and I heard multiple locks being turned from inside. I spent the next hour documenting the illegal power connection and tracing the cables back to our main line. The work was sloppy but extensive. Whoever had done this had tapped into our system in at least 6 different places, running cables underground and through the trees in a network that must have taken months to install. What bothered me wasn't just the theft, though, it was the scale of it. These people were drawing enough power to run a small factory, but the cabin couldn't have been more than 800 square feet. What were they using all that electricity for? I followed the cable network deeper into the woods, using my voltage detector to trace the live lines. About a quarter-mile from the cabin, I found the answer, and I almost turned around and left right then. There was a clearing in the trees, maybe 50 feet across, and it was filled with the most bizarre electrical setup I'd ever seen. Dozens of car batteries arranged in rows, connected by a maze of cables and jury-rigged power supplies. Old appliances, refrigerators, washing machines, space heaters, all running simultaneously despite being exposed to the weather. And scattered throughout the clearing were what looked like medical equipment, heart monitors, IV stands, machines I didn't recognize but that were clearly designed for hospital use. But the worst part was the smell. That same ozone and burned plastic odor from the cabin, but much stronger, mixed with something that reminded me of a slaughterhouse. I heard voices coming from deeper in the woods and realized there were more people around. Lots more. I could make out at least 3 or 4 different voices, all talking in the same whispered tone the woman had used. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something wrong with the cadence of their speech, like they were all speaking in unison or following some kind of script. My training told me to document everything and report back to my supervisor, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I'd stumbled onto something way more serious than simple power theft. This looked like some kind of compound, and the medical equipment suggested activities I didn't want to think about. I was backing away from the clearing when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see 3 men emerging from the tree line. They were all dressed in the same dirty work clothes. All had the same pale, hollow-eyed appearance as the woman at the cabin. But what made my blood run cold was that they were all carrying lengths of electrical cable like weapons. "You're trespassing," one of them said in that same whispered tone. "The conductor doesn't allow outsiders." "I'm with the power company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just here to check on illegal connections to our lines." "There's nothing illegal here," another one said. "Everything we do is sanctioned by the conductor. He provides the power, we provide the service." "Who's the conductor?" They looked at each other, and I saw something that chilled me to the bone. They smiled. All 3 of them, at exactly the same time, with exactly the same expression. Not a human smile, but something mechanical, practiced, like they were all following the same script. "The conductor teaches us about electricity," the first man said. "About how power flows through living things. About how bodies can be improved with the right modifications." That's when I noticed that all 3 men had scars, surgical scars on their necks, their wrists, running up their arms under their sleeves. And there was something wrong with their eyes. They had a glassy, unfocused quality that reminded me of the medical monitors I'd seen in the clearing. "I need to go," I said, starting to back away. "I'll come back another time with proper authorization." "You can't leave," the third man said, and for the first time his voice showed emotion, fear. "The conductor needs to meet you first. He's been expecting someone like you. Someone who understands electrical systems." They started moving toward me, and I saw that the cables they were carrying had been modified. Stripped wires at the ends, connected to what looked like small battery packs. Improvised electrical weapons. I ran. I'd like to say I made some heroic decision to gather evidence or try to help those people, but the truth is, I was terrified. I crashed through the woods back toward my truck, branches tearing at my clothes, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear them following, but they weren't running. They were walking, maintaining that same whispered conversation, like they knew I couldn't really escape. When I reached my truck, I fumbled with the keys for what felt like an eternity before getting the engine started. As I pulled away, I saw them emerge from the woods and stand in the road, watching me leave with those same mechanical smiles. I drove straight back to town and called my supervisor, but I didn't tell him everything. I reported the power theft and gave him the location, but I didn't mention the medical equipment or the people with the surgical scars. I told myself I needed more information before making those kinds of accusations. That was my first mistake. My supervisor sent me back 2 days later with a crew to disconnect the illegal power lines. When we arrived, the cabin was empty. Not just vacant, but stripped clean. No furniture, no electrical equipment, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. The elaborate cable network was gone too, every connection neatly severed and the cables removed. But the clearing was still there, and what we found made me wish I'd called the police instead of my supervisor. The medical equipment was gone, but there were stains on the ground where it had been. Dark stains that looked like they'd been scrubbed with bleach, but hadn't come completely clean. And scattered around the clearing were personal belongings. Wallets, jewelry, car keys, cell phones. Dozens of them, like the accumulated possessions of people who'd simply vanished. Chris, one of my crew members, called from the edge of the clearing. "You need to see this." He was standing next to a tree that had been stripped of bark in a perfect rectangle, about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide. Carved into the exposed wood were words, burned deep into the grain with what looked like electrical current. "The conductor knows you. Christopher Webb, Kentucky Power. Your skills are required. Report to Sector 7 at midnight. Resistance will result in termination." Below the message were coordinates, latitude and longitude, that placed the location about 15 miles deeper in the mountains. My hands were shaking as I photographed the carving. Whoever these people were, they knew my name, knew where I worked, and were making it clear that running away wasn't going to be enough. They wanted something from me, and they were willing to kill to get it. That night, I sat in my apartment trying to decide what to do. Call the police and risk sounding insane, drive to the coordinates and face whatever was waiting there, pack up and leave town. In the end, the decision was made for me. Around 11 p.m., my power went out. Not just my apartment. The entire neighborhood was dark. I looked out my window and saw a figure standing under the streetlight across from my building. Even from 4 stories up, I could see the pale face and hollow eyes, one of the men from the woods. My cell phone rang. "Unknown number." "Christopher Webb," the voice said. It was electronically distorted, but I could hear multiple people speaking in unison underneath the modulation. "You will report to Sector 7. You will bring your electrical testing equipment. You will assist the conductor with his research." "What research? What do you people want?" "The human nervous system operates on bioelectrical impulses. The conductor has learned to enhance and control these impulses using external power sources. Your knowledge of electrical systems will help perfect the process." The line went dead. A few seconds later, the power came back on throughout the neighborhood. When I looked out the window again, the figure was gone. I knew I should call for help, but who would believe me? And more importantly, these people had demonstrated they could control electrical systems from a distance. They'd cut power to an entire neighborhood just to make a point. How much more could they do if I really crossed them? I spent the rest of the night researching the coordinates they'd given me. Satellite images showed a large compound hidden in a valley between 2 ridges, with what looked like industrial buildings and several smaller structures. There were no roads marked on any map, but I could see tire tracks in the satellite photos. At 11:30 p.m. the next night, I loaded my testing equipment into my truck and drove toward Sector 7. I told myself I was just going to observe, to gather information I could take to the authorities. I didn't admit to myself that I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't show up. The coordinates led me to an unmarked dirt road that wasn't on any map. I followed it for about 5 miles through increasingly dense forest before emerging into a valley that shouldn't have existed. According to the topographical maps I'd studied, this area was supposed to be a continuous ridgeline. The compound was massive, at least 20 buildings spread across several acres, all connected by overhead power lines that formed a geometric pattern against the night sky. Floodlights illuminated the entire area with harsh white light, and I could hear the hum of electrical equipment from a quarter-mile away. As I approached the main gate, it opened automatically. No guards, no security checkpoint, just a chain-link fence that parted to let me through. I drove slowly through the compound, taking in details that made my skin crawl. Every building had been modified with external electrical equipment. Transformers, generators, massive cable runs that snaked between structures like veins. The windows were covered with metal mesh that sparked occasionally with electrical discharge, and there were people moving between the buildings. Dozens of them, all with that same pale, hollow-eyed appearance, all walking with the mechanical precision I'd seen in the woods. I parked outside what appeared to be the main building and sat in my truck for several minutes, trying to work up the courage to get out. Through the building's windows, I could see banks of electronic equipment and what looked like operating tables surrounded by monitors and life support machines. The driver's side door of my truck opened by itself. "Christopher Webb," a voice said from speakers hidden somewhere in the compound. "Welcome to Sector 7. Please bring your equipment and report to Laboratory 3. I had no choice. I gathered my testing gear and walked toward the building, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. The people moving through the compound didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could feel them watching me with those glassy, unfocused eyes. Laboratory 3 was a nightmare made real. The room was filled with medical equipment, but not the kind you'd find in any hospital. Operating tables equipped with restraints and electrical contacts. Monitoring systems that measured not just vital signs but electrical activity throughout the human body. And in the center of the room, a chair that looked like an electric chair, crossed with a dialysis machine. "You're admiring my work," a voice said behind me. I turned to see a man in a white coat approaching. He was tall, thin, with graying hair, and the kind of intense eyes you see in old photographs of scientists from the 1950 seconds. But there was something wrong with his movements. Too precise, too calculated, like he was consciously controlling every muscle. "I'm Dr. Marcus Voss," he said, extending his hand. "But my associates call me the conductor. I've been looking forward to meeting someone with your expertise." I didn't shake his hand. Up close, I could see that his neck was covered with surgical scars, similar to what I'd seen on the others. But his scars were more extensive, running from his jawline down under his collar. "What is this place?" I asked. "This is the future of human evolution," he said, gesturing around the room. For decades, medical science has understood that the human nervous system operates on bioelectrical impulses, but we've been thinking too small. Why settle for the limited electrical capacity of biological tissue when we can augment it with external power sources? He led me to a wall covered with photographs and medical charts. What I saw made me physically sick. The photos showed people in various stages of surgical modification, electrical implants in their skulls, cables running under their skin, devices that replaced entire sections of their nervous systems. "The subjects you see here have all volunteered for the enhancement process," Dr. Voss continued. "They've traded their limited human consciousness for something far superior: direct connection to the electrical grid, shared processing power, freedom from the constraints of individual thought." "Those people in the woods?" I said, my voice barely working. "What did you do to them?" "Their early successes, limited modifications that allow them to interface with electrical systems and share basic information through the network. But they're just the beginning." He turned to look at me with those intense eyes. "You, Christopher, will help me perfect the process. Your understanding of electrical systems is exactly what I need to complete the final phase. I'm not helping you with anything. This is insane. These people need medical attention, not electrical modifications." His smile never wavered. "I'm afraid you misunderstand your situation. You see, you're not here as a consultant. You're here as a test subject." That's when I noticed that the other people in the room, I'd assumed they were assistants or medical staff, had moved to block the exits. They all had that same hollow-eyed expression, and I could see cable ports surgically implanted behind their ears. The enhancement process works best on subjects with existing electrical knowledge. "Doctor," Voss explained, pulling on surgical gloves. "Your brain has already been conditioned to think in terms of circuits and current flow. The modifications will integrate much more smoothly." I backed away from him, my mind racing. "You can't do this. People know where I am. My supervisor will send search teams. Mr. Webb, we've been monitoring your communications for weeks. No one knows you're here, and no one will miss you until Monday morning at the earliest. By then, the initial integration will be complete." He gestured to his assistants, and they started moving toward me. I noticed they were all carrying electrical cables with exposed wires at the ends. "The process begins with a controlled electrical shock to disrupt normal brain function, Doctor," Voss explained in the same calm tone he might use to describe a routine medical procedure. "This creates a temporary window during which we can install the initial interface hardware. Don't worry, the pain is quite brief." That's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. I swung my testing equipment bag at the nearest assistant, scattering electronic gear across the floor. While they were momentarily distracted, I lunged for the emergency shut-off switch I'd spotted on the wall when I came in. The laboratory plunged into darkness as the main power cut out. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, but those few seconds were enough for me to reach the door. I could hear Dr. Voss shouting orders behind me as I ran through the compound. But something was wrong with the emergency lighting. It kept flickering. And in the brief moments of darkness, I could see the hollow-eyed people moving through the compound with perfect coordination despite the lack of light. They weren't just modified humans, they were networked, sharing sensory information in real time. I reached my truck and fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. Behind me, I could hear footsteps approaching with that same mechanical precision. As I got the engine started, Dr. Voss emerged from the laboratory building. "You cannot escape the network, Christopher," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the compound despite the distance. "We know where you live, where you work, everyone you care about. You will return voluntarily, or we will bring you back by force." I floored the accelerator and drove toward the gate, which remained closed. For a moment I thought I was trapped, but then the gate opened automatically. Not to let me escape, but because they wanted me to know they were choosing to let me go. As I drove away from the compound, I could see Dr. Voss in my rearview mirror, standing motionless in the floodlights. Even from a distance, I could swear he was smiling. The drive back to town was a nightmare of paranoia and terror. Every approaching car might contain the hollow-eyed people. Every shadow could be hiding one of Dr. Voss's modified subjects. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, watching for any sign of movement before working up the courage to go inside. I spent the rest of the weekend trying to decide what to do. Call the police and risk sounding like I was having a psychotic break? Contact the FBI and try to explain a story that sounded like science fiction? Or pack up and disappear, hoping I could stay ahead of people who seemed capable of tracking my every move? Monday morning, the decision was made for me. I arrived at work to find my supervisor waiting with a resignation letter already prepared for my signature. "Chris, we've had some complaints about your conduct on the Sector 7 assignment," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Accusations of trespassing, equipment damage, harassment of local residents. It's best if you move on to other opportunities." I stared at him. "You sent me up there, you know what I found. I sent you to investigate power theft. According to the reports I received, you found nothing unusual, and the matter was resolved." He slid the resignation letter across his desk. "Sign this, and we'll provide positive references for future employment. Refuse, and you'll be terminated for cause." I realized that Dr. Voss had been right about one thing. They really could control more than I'd imagined. They'd gotten to my supervisor somehow, rewritten the official record, made it seem like I'd never found anything at all. I signed the letter and walked out of the building, knowing I was now completely on my own. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've been living like a fugitive, moving every few weeks, paying cash for everything, avoiding any kind of electronic trail, because they're still watching me, still hunting me. Every month or so, I'll find evidence that they've tracked me down. A power outage that affects only my building. Strange electrical interference with my radio or phone. Sometimes I'll see one of the hollow-eyed people standing across the street from wherever I'm staying, just watching and waiting. 3 weeks ago, I was staying in a motel outside Nashville when the desk clerk knocked on my door at 2 a.m. He had that same pale, hollow-eyed expression I'd learned to recognize. "Dr. Voss sends his regards," the clerk said in that monotone voice. "He wants you to know that the enhancement process has been perfected. The procedure now takes only 6 hours, and the success rate is 100%. He's prepared to offer you a signing bonus if you return voluntarily." I left that night and haven't stopped moving since, because I know that eventually they'll catch up to me. Dr. Voss has unlimited resources, a growing network of modified subjects, and the patience to wait as long as necessary. I'm telling this story because I need people to know what's out there. There are communities in remote areas where something that used to be human is conducting electrical experiments on anyone they can capture. They're building a network of modified people who can interface directly with electronic systems, and they're growing stronger every day. If you work in telecommunications, power systems, or any field that involves electrical equipment in rural areas, be careful. If you encounter people who seem too coordinated, who speak in monotone voices, who have unexplained surgical scars, run. Don't try to help them. Don't try to understand what's happening to them. Just run. And whatever you do, don't let your curiosity override your survival instincts like I did. Because once they know you have the technical knowledge they need, they'll never stop hunting you. I'm out of money and running out of places to hide. Last night, Every electronic device in my current location started displaying the same message. Final notice, report for enhancement or face termination. I think Dr. Voss is done being patient. If anyone finds this account and I've disappeared, you'll know what happened to me, and you'll know what's coming for anyone else with electrical expertise who gets too close to their operations. The network is growing, and they're always recruiting new members, whether those members volunteer or not. I was 27 when I took that substitute teaching job in Copper Ridge, Virginia. At the time, I was living paycheck to paycheck, taking whatever work I could find while trying to land a permanent position somewhere. Teaching had always been my dream, but the market was brutal, and I was starting to wonder if I'd made the right choice. The call came on a Sunday evening in October. Some administrator from the Copper Ridge School District sounded desperate. Their only teacher had a family emergency, and they needed someone immediately. The pay was decent, and honestly, I couldn't afford to be picky. When she mentioned it was a small mountain school about 45 miles from the nearest town, I figured it might even be peaceful. A nice change from the chaos of substitute teaching in the city. I packed my beat-up Honda Civic that night and drove out early Monday morning. The GPS started acting weird about 20 miles into the mountains, so I had to rely on the handwritten directions they'd given me over the phone. The roads got narrower and narrower until I was driving on what was basically a gravel path winding through thick woods. Copper Ridge wasn't really a town at all, just a cluster of buildings around a general store that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1952. The school sat at the edge of what I later learned was the Whitman family compound, a massive stretch of property where dozens of relatives lived completely off the grid. No cell towers, no internet, just traditional mountain living the way their great-great-grandparents had done it. Robert Whitman met me at the school that first morning. He was probably in his 60s, weathered and lean like most mountain folks, but there was something gentle about him that put me at ease right away. He thanked me at least 3 times for making the drive out, said the family had been worried sick about the children missing their education. The way he talked about learning, about wanting the best for these kids, reminded me why I'd gotten into teaching in the first place. The school itself was just one large room, with 12 desks arranged in neat rows. 12 students, all supposedly cousins from different branches of the Whitman family tree. Ages ranged from about 8 to 15, though it was hard to tell. Sometimes they all had this mature way of carrying themselves that seemed older than their years. From day one, those kids were the most well-behaved students I'd ever worked with. No talking out of turn, no fidgeting, no complaints about assignments. They raised their hands politely, addressed me as Mr. Miller or Sir, and followed every instruction to the letter. Part of me was relieved I'd dealt with plenty of nightmare classrooms as a substitute, but another part of me found their behavior almost unnaturally perfect. What struck me most was how eager they were to learn. These kids had been isolated from the outside world their whole lives, but they soaked up every bit of information I could give them. Math, science, history, literature, they absorbed it all with an intensity that was both impressive and somehow unsettling. They asked thoughtful questions, but never challenged anything. I said, never disagreed, never showed any of the natural skepticism or curiosity you'd expect from children their age. The family welcomed me like I was their long-lost son. That first week, they invited me for dinner every single night. Robert's wife, Margaret, was one of the best cooks I'd ever encountered, and the extended family treated me like honored guest. They offered me a small cabin on their property so I wouldn't have to make the long drive back and forth. When my original week assignment ended, they practically begged me to stay longer. The regular teacher's family situation had gotten more complicated, and they really needed someone to keep the children's education on track. I should have been thrilled. Here was steady work with grateful people in a peaceful setting. But something about the whole situation felt off in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was how all the children looked so remarkably similar despite supposedly being from different families, or how they never seemed to play or laugh or act like normal kids when they thought no one was watching. They were polite and respectful, but there was something missing, some spark of childhood joy or rebellion that should have been there. The classroom itself held clues I was only beginning to notice. Old photographs lined the walls showing previous classes, and while the adult family members in the pictures looked familiar, the children were completely different. Not just older versions of the current students, but entirely different kids, in the same poses, the same uniforms, sitting in the same arrangement. When I asked Margaret about it, she just smiled and said the mountain had always been home to lots of children over the years. I started paying more attention to the students' academic abilities. They were incredibly advanced in some subjects, particularly memorization and recitation, but had bizarre gaps in others. They could recite complex historical dates and mathematical formulas, but they'd never heard of modern technology or pop culture. When I mentioned movies or music, they looked at me with genuine confusion. They knew nothing about the world beyond their mountain, which wasn't entirely unusual for isolated communities, but their ignorance felt too complete, too systematic. More disturbing were the personal questions they couldn't answer. When I asked about their early childhood memories, they all gave the same response. They started remembering things clearly around age 8, but everything before that was fuzzy. Even the 15-year-old couldn't tell me anything specific about being a young child. They all claimed their earliest clear memory was beginning school, sitting in those same desks, learning from teachers who came and went over the years. The family compound itself was impressive in its self-sufficiency. They had their own power generation, water systems, food production, and medical facilities. Robert proudly showed me around during my second week, explaining how his grandfather had established the settlement in the 1922 and how they'd been living independently ever since. But the medical building was oddly sophisticated for a remote mountain community. Equipment that looked expensive and modern, rooms that seemed more like surgical suites than the basic first aid facilities you'd expect. When I asked about it, Robert explained that several family members had medical training, and they tried to handle their own health care rather than relying on outside hospitals. Made sense for people living this far from civilization, but something about the setup felt too advanced, too sterile. The whole building had an institutional quality that didn't match the rustic, traditional atmosphere of the rest of the compound. That's when I started noticing inconsistencies in the school records. Filing through the attendance books and class rosters, I found evidence of 30 or 40 students over the past decade, but only 12 were currently enrolled. When I asked Robert about the missing children, he said families sometimes moved away or older kids went to live with relatives in other states. Perfectly reasonable explanation. But it didn't explain why there were no records of these transfers, no forwarding information, no way to track where these children had gone. The breakthrough came during my third week when I was organizing the supply closet and found a loose floorboard. Underneath was a small space containing personal items, jewelry, photographs, identification cards that clearly belonged to other adults. Other teachers, judging by the professional clothes and educational materials mixed in with the personal effects. Some of the IDs were for people who'd supposedly never worked at the school, according to the family's records. I confronted Robert about the items that evening. He looked genuinely surprised and concerned, explaining that the school building was old and had been used for storage over the years. Previous teachers might have left personal items behind, or the space might contain belongings from family members who'd passed away. His explanation was reasonable, but the way he avoided eye contact told me he was hiding something significant. That night, alone in my cabin, I started putting together the pieces that had been nagging at me for weeks. The identical behavioral patterns among the students, their lack of early childhood memories, the sophisticated medical facilities, the missing children from school records, the personal belongings of teachers who'd apparently vanished without a trace. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of confronting anyone directly or trying to investigate further during the day, I decided to explore the school building after midnight when everyone would be asleep. If there was something to find, I'd find it and get out before anyone knew I'd been there. The school had a basement I'd never been shown, accessible through a door I'd assumed was just storage. It wasn't locked in this trusting community, nothing ever was. What I found down there still gives me nightmares 15 years later. The basement opened into a massive underground complex that stretched far beyond the school's footprint. Medical laboratories with equipment more sophisticated than most hospitals. Operating rooms with surgical lights and monitoring equipment, computer terminals connected to databases containing detailed files on hundreds of children's medical records, psychological profiles, genetic information, behavioral modification protocols. But the worst part was the documentation. detailed records of medical procedures performed on children over decades, memory suppression techniques, surgical alterations to change physical appearance, psychological conditioning protocols designed to create perfect obedience and compliance. Photos showing children before and after these procedures, different faces, different bone structures, but wearing the same school uniforms I saw every day. The Whitman family wasn't just running a school. They were operating a sophisticated child trafficking and modification operation. They kidnapped children from various locations, brought them to the compound, and used medical and psychological techniques to erase their original identities and create new ones. The children I'd been teaching weren't biological relatives. They were victims who'd been surgically altered to look similar and psychologically programmed to believe they were family. The buyers were wealthy couples from around the world who wanted custom children with specific traits and absolute obedience. The medical files showed that children who didn't survive the modification procedures were buried on the property, while successful cases were either kept for breeding purposes or sold to clients who'd paid extraordinary sums for guaranteed compliant adoptions. My hands were shaking as I photographed as much documentation as I could with my phone. Names, dates, locations, financial records, client lists, everything I could capture before getting out of there. But as I was preparing to leave, I heard footsteps upstairs, heavy boots moving purposefully toward the basement entrance. Robert Whitman appeared at the top of the stairs with 3 other family members, all carrying hunting rifles. His gentle demeanor was completely gone, replaced by cold calculation. He explained calmly that they'd been monitoring the building with motion sensors, and that I'd seen far too much to be allowed to leave. The chase through those underground tunnels was the most terrifying experience of my life. The family knew every passage and exit, while I was stumbling through darkness with only my phone's flashlight. They weren't trying to kill me immediately. They needed to capture me alive to find out who I might have told about my discoveries. But I had one advantage they hadn't counted on. Some of the older students had been showing signs of recovering their original memories, and one of them had been leaving me subtle hints for days. Small notes hidden in assignments, hand gestures that seemed like attempts to communicate something. That night, as I fled through the medical complex, I found messages carved into the wall, arrows pointing toward an exit tunnel that led to the far side of the mountain. The escape route emerged nearly 2 miles from the main compound, well beyond their search perimeter. I stole a truck from an outlying cabin and drove straight through the night to the FBI field office in Richmond, arriving with a phone full of photographic evidence and a story that sounded impossible but was meticulously documented. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. Within 6 hours, multiple agencies had surrounded the compound and arrested 23 family members. They rescued 47 children in various stages of the modification process, some of whom had been missing for years while their families believed they were dead. The investigation that followed exposed an international network of child trafficking and illegal adoption that had been operating for over 30 years. Wealthy clients from 6 countries were arrested, and dozens of children were eventually reunited with their biological families. Some of the younger victims had been so thoroughly conditioned that recovering their original identities required years of therapy, but most of them eventually remembered who they really were. I never went back to teaching. The experience shattered my faith in the basic safety of isolated communities and my ability to protect children under my care. I work with the FBI now, specializing in cases involving missing children and human trafficking. It's difficult work, but every case we solve, every child we bring home, helps me deal with the guilt of not recognizing what was happening sooner. The Whitman compound was demolished, and the property was turned into a memorial for the victims. Sometimes I drive by when I'm working cases in Virginia, just to remind myself that evil can hide behind the most convincing facades of kindness and community. Robert Whitman is serving life in federal prison, but I still wake up some nights thinking about that gentle way he'd thanked me for caring about the children's education, knowing all along what he was really planning for me and for them. To this day, I can't look at exceptionally well-behaved children without feeling a chill down my spine. Perfect obedience isn't natural for kids, and when you see it, it's worth asking why. I'm 29 years old and work as a cable internet technician for Mountaineer Communications out of Charleston. I've been doing rural installations for about 6 years now, ever since I got out of the army and needed steady work that kept me outdoors. My specialty is getting internet to places where most companies won't even bother sending a truck. The deep hauler communities, the off-grid families, the folks who live so far back in the mountains that GPS gives up halfway there. It's good work, honest work, and the commission on those big rural contracts helped me buy a little house and keep my truck running. I never thought much about the ethics of it all back then. You want internet? I'll find a way to get it to you. That was my motto. I wish I'd been a little more curious about why some folks wanted to be connected so badly when they'd spent so much effort getting disconnected from everything else. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October of 2019. My supervisor, Dale, handed me a work order that made my eyes light up. 15 families living in a remote community in Pocahontas County wanted a shared satellite internet installation. The kind of setup that would take me a full week to complete and earn more commission than I usually made in 2 months. They'd already put down a cash deposit that covered all the equipment. Enterprise-grade stuff that cost more than most people's cars. Dale scratched his head when he handed me the paperwork and said these folks had called around to every internet provider in 3 states before finding us. They specifically wanted someone who specialized in off-grid installations and had experience with complex network setups. The community spokesperson was a woman named Amanda Walsh. When I called the number on the work order, she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting by the phone. Her voice was educated, professional, not what I expected from someone living off-grid in the mountains. She explained that their community had pooled resources to bring high-speed internet to their settlement. They'd moved to the mountains to escape the complications of modern society, she said, but their various businesses still required reliable internet access. The way she talked about it made perfect sense. Lots of folks were doing remote work these days, running online businesses from cabins in the woods, the American dream with better scenery and cleaner air. Amanda gave me detailed directions to their property that involved county roads, logging roads, and finally a private road that wasn't on any map. She warned me it would take about 2 hours to drive there from the main highway, and that cell service cut out completely about 10 miles before I reached their community. She'd meet me at the gate, she said, and guide me to where they wanted the main satellite array installed. The families had already cleared the installation sites and run underground power cables to support the equipment. That level of preparation wasn't unusual for off-grid folks. They tend to be pretty self-sufficient and technically minded. What struck me as odd was how specific she got about the technical requirements. Most customers just want fast internet. Amanda rattled off bandwidth specifications, encryption protocols, and network security features like she was reading from a technical manual. I spent the next 3 days ordering equipment and planning the installation. This wasn't going to be your standard residential setup. They wanted enterprise-grade satellite internet with redundant connections, military specification encryption, and a network configuration that would make a small corporation jealous. The equipment alone filled the back of my truck and part of the cab. Amanda had emphasized that they needed the installation completed as quickly as possible and offered a substantial bonus if I finished ahead of schedule. She also insisted on paying the remaining balance in cash, which wasn't unusual for off-grid communities that didn't trust banks much. Everything about the job seemed straightforward, if unusually well-funded. The drive to their property took me through some of the most beautiful country in West Virginia. October in the mountains is something special. The leaves were turning, the air was crisp, and the morning fog hung in the valleys like something out of a postcard. I'd driven these mountain roads my whole life, but the deeper I went into Pocahontas County, the more isolated everything became. The last gas station I passed was about 40 miles from Amanda's community, and after that, it was just forest and the occasional hunting cabin. My cell phone lost signal exactly where Amanda said it would, about 10 miles from their private road. The silence was complete out there. No traffic noise, no power lines humming, just the sound of my truck's engine echoing off the ridgelines. The private road was well-maintained gravel that wound through thick forest for about 3 miles before opening into a clearing. That's where I got my first look at their community, and honestly, I was impressed. This wasn't some collection of ramshackle cabins thrown together by people fleeing civilization. The buildings were modern, well-constructed, and designed to blend with the natural environment. Solar panels on every roof, satellite dishes that looked professional grade, and what appeared to be a small communications tower already in place. These folks had money and knew how to use it. Amanda met me at the gate just like she promised. She was probably in her 40s, dressed in practical outdoor clothing, and carried herself like someone used to being in charge. When she shook my hand, I noticed her grip was firm and her hands were soft, not the hands of someone who did much manual labor. She gave me a tour of the community while explaining where they wanted the internet infrastructure installed. The 15 families lived in houses that were scattered across about 100 acres, connected by well-maintained gravel paths. Each house looked like an upscale vacation cabin from the outside, but Amanda pointed out details that revealed serious money behind the construction. Geothermal heating, rainwater collection systems, backup generators, and communication equipment that looked more sophisticated than what most small towns had. The families were mostly couples with children, she explained, all professionals who could work remotely and had chosen this lifestyle for privacy and environmental reasons. What struck me as interesting was how few people I actually saw during that tour. Amanda explained that most folks were working during the day and preferred not to be disturbed, but I usually see at least some signs of normal family life in communities like this. Kids playing outside, laundry hanging on lines, dogs running around. This place felt more like an upscale resort during the off-season than a place where families actually lived. The houses were too clean, too quiet, and spaced too far apart for a community that supposedly shared resources and made decisions together. Amanda led me to the site where they wanted the main satellite array installed. It was on high ground in the center of the community with clear sky access and underground power already run to the location. Someone with serious technical knowledge had planned this installation. The power setup was more sophisticated than most commercial installations I'd worked on, with backup batteries and surge protection that cost more than my truck. When I asked about their existing internet setup, Amanda showed me a small building that housed their current communication equipment. Inside was computer and networking gear that belonged in a corporate data center, not an off-grid mountain community. This wasn't hobby-level stuff. Someone had spent serious money building a professional-grade network infrastructure. The families had also prepared detailed network specifications for the installation. They wanted the satellite internet integrated with their existing systems, using specific security protocols and encryption methods. Amanda handed me a folder with network diagrams, IP address schemes, and configuration requirements that would have impressed most IT professionals. When I asked why they needed such sophisticated network security for a residential community, she explained that several families ran consulting businesses that required client confidentiality. Privacy was one of the main reasons they'd chosen to live so far from urban areas, and they took digital security as seriously as physical security. Over the next 3 days, I worked on installing and configuring their internet system. The technical requirements were complex, but the families had done their homework. Every piece of equipment had been carefully chosen and properly planned. What surprised me was how knowledgeable several of the residents were about networking and telecommunications. When I ran into configuration issues, there was always someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. These weren't just successful professionals who'd moved to the mountains. Some of them had serious technical expertise in areas that were way beyond what most people would need for running online businesses. The children in the community were well-behaved and obviously well-educated, but they seemed unusually quiet around adults. Most mountain kids I met were curious about my work and asked questions about the equipment. These kids stayed close to their parents and didn't interact with me much. The adults explained that they homeschooled their children and maintained strict schedules for education and activities. Everything about the community was organized, planned, and controlled in ways that felt more institutional than familial. It wasn't necessarily wrong, just different from other off-grid communities I'd worked with. On the third day of installation, I was configuring the final network connections in the main equipment building when I noticed several computer workstations running programs I didn't recognize. The screens showed what looked like file-sharing networks with sophisticated encryption and anonymous routing protocols. When I asked Amanda about the software, she explained that several families were involved in digital privacy consulting and used advanced tools to test network security for their clients. That made sense. There was definitely money in cybersecurity consulting, and the technical infrastructure they'd built could support that kind of business. What didn't make sense was why I kept glimpsing things on those computer screens that made my stomach turn. Quick flashes of images that looked wrong. I told myself I was seeing things, that the complex software was probably just displaying test data or diagnostic information. But there's a difference between seeing something you don't understand and seeing something that makes you feel sick. I've worked on computer networks for years, and I know the difference between legitimate business software and something else entirely. It was late afternoon on Thursday when I saw something I couldn't rationalize away. I was testing network connectivity on one of the workstations when the screen refreshed and displayed a folder full of image thumbnails. For just a few seconds, before someone closed the window remotely, I saw images of children that made me freeze. Children who looked like they lived in this community. Children in situations that no child should ever be in. The person who closed the window was sitting at another workstation across the room, and when I looked over at him, he was already looking back at me with an expression that told me he knew exactly what I'd seen. That's when I understood why this community needed enterprise-grade internet with military specification encryption. Why they'd moved to one of the most isolated locations in West Virginia. Why they had sophisticated networking equipment and serious money behind their operation. Why the children were so quiet and controlled around adults. Why they needed high-speed internet despite claiming to want escape from modern society. This wasn't a community of families living an alternative lifestyle. This was something much worse, and I'd just finished giving them the tools to do it more efficiently. Amanda appeared beside me before I could figure out how to react. Her professional demeanor was unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that made it clear the situation had shifted. She suggested we step outside to discuss the final installation details, and her tone made it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. Walking toward the door, I noticed that several other adults had gathered near the building's entrance. They weren't blocking my path exactly, but they were definitely paying attention to where I was going. Outside, Amanda explained that the community valued privacy above all else, and that everyone who worked on their property signed confidentiality agreements. She had paperwork ready for me to sign, documents that would legally prevent me from discussing anything I'd seen or learned about their community. The language was complex and included serious financial penalties for violating the agreement. When I hesitated, she mentioned that other technicians had been happy to sign similar agreements and had been well compensated for their discretion. The way she said other technicians made me wonder what had happened to the people who'd installed their existing equipment. I signed the papers because I didn't see any other choice, but I was already planning my escape. The problem was that my truck had been parked inside their community for 3 days, and several people would notice if I suddenly decided to leave before completing the installation. I still had network testing and documentation to finish, work that would take most of the next day. Amanda seemed satisfied with my cooperation and explained that they'd pay my final invoice in cash the next morning when I finished the job. She also mentioned that they'd be happy to recommend my services to other communities that valued privacy and discretion. That night, I finished the installation work but also used their own internet connection to document everything I'd seen. I copied network configuration files, IP addresses, user account information, and routing protocols onto a thumb drive hidden in my toolkit. Using their own sophisticated network against them, I managed to contact the FBI's cybercrime unit through anonymous channels and uploaded everything I'd gathered. The federal agents I reached understood immediately what kind of operation they were dealing with and began coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to track the community's connections to larger networks. Friday morning, Amanda paid my final invoice in cash and thanked me for my professional service. She walked me to my truck and reminded me about the confidentiality agreement I'd signed. As I drove away from their community, I expected to feel relief, but instead I felt sick knowing that the internet connection I'd installed would be used to hurt children. I'd followed the law by reporting what I'd found, but I wasn't sure if that would be enough or if it would happen in time to help the children I'd seen living in that community. The FBI raid happened 3 weeks later. Federal agents arrested 23 adults and recovered 8 children who'd been systematically abused for years. The network I'd helped install had connected them to similar operations in 12 other countries, and the evidence led to arrests and rescues around the world. The case made national news, but most of the coverage focused on the international criminal network rather than the technical infrastructure that made it possible. I testified at the federal trial about the network configuration and equipment I'd installed, but I never had to testify about what I'd seen on those computer screens. The evidence the FBI gathered during their raid was more than sufficient for conviction. I don't work for Mountaineer Communications anymore. After the trial, I was recruited by the FBI's cybercrime unit to help investigate similar operations. It turns out that my combination of networking expertise and experience with isolated communities makes me useful for understanding how these criminal networks operate. It's harder work emotionally, but I know that my technical skills are being used to help children instead of hurt them. I've helped shut down operations in 6 states over the past few years, and each case teaches us more about how these networks function and how to stop them more quickly. Looking back, I still wonder what happened to the other technicians who'd worked on that community's network before me. The FBI investigation never found any evidence of what happened to them, and their names weren't in any of the community's records. Sometimes I think about how close I came to just signing that confidentiality agreement and walking away, telling myself it wasn't my business what people did with their internet connections. The only reason I didn't was that I couldn't stop seeing those children's faces, and I couldn't live with myself knowing I'd helped enable their abuse. These days, I'm more careful about the jobs I take and more curious about why people want the technical services they're requesting. Technology is just a tool, but it's a powerful tool that can be used for terrible purposes by people who understand how to exploit it. I learned that there's no such thing as ethically neutral technical work. Everything we build and install and configure becomes part of someone's larger plan. The question is whether we take responsibility for understanding what that plan actually is, or whether we choose to remain ignorant for the sake of convenience and profit. I was 31 when I took that delivery route through the eastern Tennessee mountains, and honestly, I thought it was going to save my family. My name's Marcus, and I'd been driving for UPS for about 6 years at that point, mostly doing suburban routes around Knoxville. Nothing exciting, but it paid the bills. Then my wife Sarah got pregnant, and we found out there were complications. High-risk pregnancy, they called it. Meant a lot more doctor visits, a lot more tests, and a whole lot more medical bills that our insurance only covered part of. We were drowning financially, and when my supervisor mentioned this rural route that had opened up, previous driver quit without much explanation, I jumped at it. The overtime pay alone would double what I was making, and honestly, we needed every penny we could get. The route covered about 200 square miles of mountain country, way out where cell service got spotty and GPS sometimes just gave up entirely. These were families who lived completely off the grid, some by choice, some because running power lines up those ridges would cost more than most people make in a lifetime. They depended on deliveries for everything: medical supplies, equipment, basic necessities they couldn't get in town. Most of them only came down from the mountains maybe once or twice a year, if that. The previous driver, a guy named Eddie, had been doing that route for almost 8 years before he suddenly put in his notice. Nobody really talked about why he left, and to be honest, I didn't ask. I was too focused on the extra money and getting Sarah the care she needed. My first week on the route, I have to admit, I was pretty nervous. These weren't addresses you could find on any map. They were directions like, turn left at the big oak with the tire swing, go 2 miles until you see the propane tanks, then follow the dirt road until it forks. But the families I met were some of the friendliest people I'd ever encountered. Always grateful, always offering me something to drink or eat, and the tips were incredible. Sometimes $50, $60 on top of whatever they were paying for their packages. These weren't wealthy people by any stretch, but they took care of the person who took care of them. There was the Harrison family, older couple who ordered medical equipment for the husband's breathing problems. Sweet people who always asked about Sarah and how she was feeling. The Coopers had about 6 kids running around their property, and they'd order educational supplies, books, sometimes toys. Mrs. Cooper always made me take home a jar of honey or some preserves. Then there were the younger families, people in their 20s and 30s who'd moved up there to get away from everything, live simple. They were the ones ordering solar panels, generators, equipment to make their homesteads more self-sufficient. What struck me was how much they all seemed to know each other, even though their properties were miles apart. They'd ask me to pass along messages, or mention that they'd heard the Millers were expecting another baby, or that the Jenkins's cow had gotten loose again. It felt like a real community, just spread out across a lot of mountain ridges. And they made me feel like part of it. Within a month, I knew most of their names, their kids' names, their situations. Mrs. Harrison would ask about Sarah's latest doctor appointment, and Mr. Cooper would joke about me getting enough sleep before the baby came. The money was even better than I'd hoped. Between the overtime and the generous tips, I was making almost twice my regular salary. For the first time since we'd found out about the pregnancy complications, I wasn't lying awake at night worrying about bills. Sarah was able to see the specialist as often as she needed to, and we even started putting a little money aside for the baby. Those mountain families were literally saving our future, and I was grateful every single day for that route. Looking back now, I think it was around my 3rd month that I started noticing the patterns. It was subtle at first, just little things that seemed a bit odd when I really thought about them, like how the younger families, the ones in their 20s and 30s, always seemed to be ordering large quantities of the same types of supplies. Fertilizer was big, industrial-grade stuff that seemed like way more than you'd need for a garden, even a big one. Diesel fuel, too, in those big containers. Electronics components that I couldn't really identify but looked expensive. At first, I figured they were all just trying to be as self-sufficient as possible. Maybe they were sharing resources, buying in bulk to save money, but then I started noticing that different families would order components that seemed like they'd work together. The Mitchells would get some kind of heating equipment one week, and the very next week the Prices would order ventilation systems. The Youngs ordered a bunch of glassware that looked more like lab equipment than kitchen supplies. And a few days later, the Davises would get industrial-grade chemicals. The weird part was how they started asking me about delivery schedules. Not just when I'd be there, but exactly when, down to the hour if possible. And they wanted to know about my other stops, who I was delivering to before them, who came after. Said they were trying to coordinate with their neighbors on some projects, but something about the way they asked felt off, like they were trying to make sure certain deliveries happened when other people wouldn't be around to see them. Then there were the cash payments. Now, a lot of mountain people prefer cash, don't trust banks, don't like electronic records. I get it, but the amounts started getting crazy. I'm talking about people paying me $300–400 in cash for deliveries that should have cost maybe $50. When I'd try to give them change, they'd just wave me off, say to keep it as a tip. I wasn't complaining about the money, but it started feeling less like tips and more like, I don't know, payments for something else. The families got more secretive too. When I first started, they'd chat for 10–15 minutes, ask about my family, offer me food. But gradually, they became all business. Get the packages, pay cash, send me on my way. And they'd give me these specific instructions about where to leave things. Not by the door anymore, but hidden under tarps or around back where nobody could see from the road. Said they were worried about theft, but who's going to steal from a property 20 miles up a mountain road? Around my 5th month, things got really strange. The family started asking detailed questions about how UPS tracking worked, what kind of security protocols we had, whether law enforcement could access our delivery records. They claimed they were having problems with packages being stolen and wanted to know what kind of protection they had. But the way they asked felt like they were trying to figure out how much the company could track about their orders and deliveries. That's when I started paying closer attention to what I was actually delivering. And once I really looked at the combinations of chemicals, the equipment, the amounts involved, well, it didn't take a chemistry degree to figure out what was going on. The fertilizer, the diesel fuel, the glassware, the heating and ventilation equipment. It was all stuff you'd need to manufacture. Methamphetamine. Not small-scale, personal use stuff either. We're talking about industrial-level production. I felt sick when I realized it. All those friendly families, all that money they'd been paying me, I was being used to supply a massive drug operation. These people weren't self-sufficient homesteaders trying to live off the grid. They were running connected meth labs across dozens of properties, and I was their delivery system for precursor chemicals and equipment. The reason Eddie, the previous driver, had quit suddenly made perfect sense now. He'd probably figured out the same thing I had. But here's the thing that really scared me. Once I knew what was happening, I started noticing things about the local law enforcement too. Sheriff's deputies would sometimes be parked along the mountain roads when I was making deliveries, but they never stopped me. never asked questions. A couple of times, I saw deputy vehicles actually parked at some of the properties I was delivering to. These weren't raids or investigations. The officers were there having friendly conversations with the same people who were ordering meth-making supplies through me. The whole local law enforcement system was compromised. These families weren't just manufacturing drugs, they were paying off the people who were supposed to stop them. And I was right in the middle of it all, with a paper trail of every delivery, every location, every person involved. I knew where all the labs were, I knew the names of all the people running them, and I had months of records showing exactly what supplies were going where. That's when I realized I was in serious danger. These people didn't see me as their friendly delivery driver anymore. I was a witness to a federal drug trafficking operation. The conversations got even shorter, and I started catching little comments that made my blood run cold. Things like, "We might need to handle the delivery problem soon," or "Can't afford to have loose ends driving around." One afternoon, while I was dropping off a package at the Young's place, I heard Mrs. Young on the phone saying something about the driver knows too much and might need to go the same way as Eddie. Eddie didn't quit. Eddie was dead. I was terrified to keep making deliveries, but I was also terrified to stop. These people knew where I lived, knew about Sarah's pregnancy, knew our routines. If I suddenly stopped showing up or tried to quit, they'd know I'd figured out their operation. And they'd already shown they were willing to kill to protect it. That night, I sat Sarah down and told her everything. We both knew we had to get help, but we couldn't trust local law enforcement. So I did something that probably saved our lives. I contacted the DEA field office in Memphis, far enough away that there was no chance the agents were connected to the local corruption. I explained what I'd discovered, showed them months of delivery records, and offered to help them build a case. What followed was the most terrifying 3 weeks of my life. The DEA moved Sarah to a safe house in another state while I continued making my deliveries, this time wearing recording equipment. Every conversation, every transaction, every mention of the drug operation was being documented. I had to act completely normal while knowing that these people were planning to kill me and that federal agents were building a case that would destroy their entire operation. The day of the raids, I made my normal deliveries, wearing a wire and following my usual route. At exactly 2 p.m., coordinated teams of DEA agents, state police, and federal marshals hit 15 properties simultaneously. I was with the team that raided the Mitchell's place, which turned out to be the central processing lab for the entire operation. The smell when we walked into that barn was overwhelming. Chemicals, heat, something toxic that made your eyes water just breathing it. Some of the families went quietly, but others fought back. The Prices had armed themselves and shot it out with federal agents for almost an hour. 2 agents were wounded, and both Mr. and Mrs. Price were killed. The Davises tried to destroy evidence by setting fire to their lab, which caused an explosion that could be heard for miles. When it was all over, the DEA had shut down a methamphetamine operation that was producing about $50 million worth of drugs annually. They arrested 34 people across those mountain communities, and every single one of them was convicted. Sentences ranged from 15 years to life in prison. The operation had been supplying dealers across 5 states, and its shutdown made national news. But for me and Sarah, the victory came with a price. Even with most of the operation behind bars, there were family members, friends, people connected to the drug ring who hadn't been caught. The threats started immediately. Phone calls in the middle of the night, cars following us around town, people showing up at Sarah's workplace, asking questions about her schedule. The federal marshals didn't mess around. Within a week of the trial's ending, they had us in witness protection. New names, new social security numbers, new life in a state I won't mention. Sarah gave birth to our son 2 months later, healthy and perfect, in a hospital where nobody knew our real names or why we were there. I work for the federal government now, training DEA agents and local law enforcement to recognize signs of rural drug operations. It's good work, and it feels like I'm making a difference, using what happened to me to help stop other operations before they get as big as the one I stumbled into. Sarah and I are doing well. Our son is healthy and happy, and we've built a good life in our new location. But we can never go back to Tennessee, can never contact our old friends or family, can never be Marcus and Sarah Johnson again. Sometimes I think about those mountain roads, about the families who seemed so kind and generous, and I wonder how I could have been so blind to what was really happening. I still get nervous when I see UPS trucks, wondering if there's another driver out there who doesn't realize what they're really delivering, who doesn't understand that their route is feeding something dark and dangerous. I hope not, but I know these operations exist all over rural America, hidden in places where people don't ask too many questions and law enforcement might not be paying close enough attention. The hardest part is knowing that my family is safe, but we can never really go home again. That's the price of doing the right thing sometimes. You save a lot of lives, but you lose your own life in the process, even if you survive. We're different people now, literally and figuratively. And sometimes I miss the simple days when delivering packages was just delivering packages, and mountain families were just friendly neighbors trying to live off the grid. But then I think about all the lives that operation was destroying with the drugs they were manufacturing, and I know we made the right choice. It's just not a choice you ever really get to stop living with.